We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
There are some puzzling new developments tonight in the ongoing search for Nancy Guthrie.
And when he talks about Chris, he's obviously talking about the sheriff, Jesse, and he went on to explain that he believes, that the sheriff wanted to handle this all on his own. That's why he didn't call in the FBI sooner, and that he should have.
And also the Cajun Navy. We've always wondered, why not just take their help, who have this expertise?
Yeah.
It's concerning, to say the least, when you hear it from somebody who knows him. Look, and that's his opinion.
Why would investigators begin looking at someone inside the system after weeks of focusing outward? According to recent reporting and analysis, a new piece of evidence has shifted attention in the Nancy Guthrie case not toward a stranger, but towards someone with official access to information early in the investigation. In this video, we are going to walk through what changed, what that evidence actually shows, and how it fits into the timeline we already know. Before we go step by step, take a moment to think about this. When new evidence points in a completely different direction, does it mean the earlier theory was wrong or simply incomplete? If you find these careful, evidence-based breakdowns helpful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these updates coming as new details develop. Now, let's go back to what most people believed at the beginning. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, living alone in the Catalina foothills area near Tucson, Arizona. On the 31st of January 2026, she returns home at approximately 9:50 p.m. Her garage door closes. There are no immediate signs of distress. For several hours, everything appears normal. Then, early the next morning, the timeline begins to form. At 1:47 a.m., her front door camera stops transmitting. At 2:12 a.m., motion is detected on the property. And at 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker stops syncing data. Those three timestamps became the foundation of the case. From that point forward, the assumption was relatively clear. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie likely occurred within that 1-minute window. And because of that, early investigative focus stayed close to the home, the house itself, the immediate property, and the nearby roads leading out of the neighborhood. Search teams moved outward gradually, but the core belief remained the same. This was something that happened quickly and locally. So what does this tell us? It tells us the investigation started with a narrow, time-defined focus centered on the home. Now, here's where things begin to change. As the investigation developed, attention expanded beyond just physical evidence. Investigators began reviewing communication records, phone logs, access records, and the sequence of who knew what and when. And that shift matters. Because when you move from physical evidence to information flow, you begin asking a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but who had knowledge of it early on. Now, according to reporting, one of the newer areas of focus involves how quickly certain details about the case became known within local law enforcement channels. Specifically, the timing of when key information such as the camera outage and motion detection was accessed and discussed. And this is where the central contradiction begins to take shape. Because in most investigations, information follows a predictable path. It is collected, documented, reviewed, and then shared in stages. But in this case, there are indications that some details may have been accessed or referenced earlier than expected. Now, to be clear, that does not automatically suggest wrongdoing. There are legitimate reasons for early access: supervisory review, emergency coordination, internal briefings. All of these can explain why someone might see information before it is widely documented. But here's the key point. The timing of that access becomes important when it does not align with the official sequence. So what does this tell us? It tells us that investigators are now looking not just at evidence, but at how that evidence moved through the system. Now let's look at the first key piece of information tied to this shift: access logs. In modern investigations, especially those involving digital systems, every interaction leaves a record. When a file is opened, when footage is reviewed, when data is downloaded, these actions are typically timestamped. And those timestamps can be compared against the official timeline of the investigation. According to reporting, some of these logs showed activity that raised questions, not necessarily because of what was accessed, but because of when it was accessed. Now here's where things get complicated. Access logs do not explain intent. They show action, but not the reason behind it. So investigators have to interpret them carefully. Was the access part of a routine review? Was it tied to a specific task? Or does it fall outside what would normally be expected at that stage? And that is where context becomes critical. Now let's connect this back to the timeline we already know. If key data such as camera footage or motion alerts was accessed earlier than the formal review process suggests, it raises a simple question. How did that information move so quickly? Because in most cases, there is a delay between an event occurring and that event being fully processed and analyzed. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the flow of information in this case may not have followed the standard pattern. Now, let's bring in another detail. According to analysis discussed in coverage of the case, some of these access patterns were associated with individuals who had supervisory or administrative roles. People who would have the ability to review data early. And again, that alone is not unusual. But when combined with timing discrepancies, it becomes something investigators take a closer look at. Now, this is where the narrative begins to shift. Up to this point, most of the focus had been on external possibilities. Someone coming onto the property, movement away from the home, searches in the surrounding desert. But this new angle introduces a different possibility. That part of the investigation may involve examining actions taken within the system itself. So what does this tell us? It tells us the case is no longer focused only on what happened outside, but also on how information inside the investigation was handled. Now, as we close this first part, there is one key takeaway to keep in mind. The new evidence does not provide a conclusion, but it does introduce a new direction. It shifts attention from purely physical events to the timing and flow of information within the investigation. And that shift changes the questions investigators are asking. In the next part, we are going to look more closely at those access logs, how investigators interpret them, and what inconsistencies begin to appear when you compare them directly with the official timeline. Because once you place those two side by side, the differences become much clearer. Let's take a closer look at those access logs and what they actually show. Because this is where the investigation becomes more technical but also more precise. In most modern systems, especially those used by law enforcement, access is recorded down to the minute and sometimes even the second. When someone opens a file, views camera footage, or checks a system alert, that action is logged automatically. And those logs are not easy to alter without leaving a trace. So, investigators treat them as a reliable record of activity. Now, according to reporting, when these logs were reviewed in the Nancy Guthrie case, a pattern began to stand out. Certain files, particularly those related to the home's camera system and motion alerts, were accessed earlier than expected in the official sequence. To understand why that matters, we need to look at how information is usually processed. When an event occurs, such as a camera going offline at 1:47 a.m., that data is stored. It is not immediately reviewed in detail. Instead, it becomes part of a larger set of information that is later examined once the situation is recognized as significant. In other words, there is usually a gap between the event itself and the moment investigators begin closely analyzing it. But in this case, some of that analysis may have started sooner. Now, here's where things get complicated. Early access can happen for legitimate reasons. A supervisor might review alerts as they come in. A dispatcher might flag unusual activity. Or a system might automatically push notifications that require immediate attention. So the presence of early access alone does not prove anything. What matters is how that access lines up with everything else. So what does this tell us? It tells us the meaning of those logs depends entirely on context. Now, let's look at one of the inconsistencies investigators are reportedly examining. The timing of when certain details were known internally compared to when they were formally documented. In most cases, documentation follows a clear order. An event occurs. It is recorded. Then it is reviewed. And finally, it is written into official reports. But here, there are indications that some knowledge may have existed before it appears in the formal record. That creates a gap between awareness and documentation. And that gap is what investigators are trying to understand. Now, here's an example of how that matters. If motion was detected at 2:12 a.m., but that information appears to have been accessed or discussed before the formal review process began, investigators would ask a simple question. How was that information identified so quickly? Was it part of a real-time monitoring system? Or was someone actively checking data before the event was fully recognized as part of a larger case? So what does this tell us? It tells us the timing of awareness is just as important as the timing of the event itself. Now, let's bring in another layer. Investigators do not look at logs in isolation. They compare them with communication records, phone calls, radio transmissions, internal message. Because if someone accessed information early, there is often a corresponding communication that explains why. And this is where patterns begin to form. According to analysis discussed in coverage of the case, some of these communication patterns may not fully align with the expected sequence. In other words, there are moments where activity appears without a clear, documented trigger. Now, to be clear, that does not automatically indicate anything improper. There are always gaps in fast-moving situations. People act before everything is written down. But when those gaps appear in multiple places, investigators begin to look more closely. So what does this tell us? It tells us that consistency across records is what gives confidence in a timeline, and inconsistency is what draws attention. Now, let's return to the role of individuals within the system. As mentioned earlier, some of the access activity is associated with people who had supervisory or administrative roles. That means they had the authority to view information early. But it also means their actions are more closely examined, because their access is expected to follow certain procedures. Now, here's where the tension builds. If the timing of that access does not align with the documented flow of the investigation, it raises a question. Was the information being reviewed ahead of the official process? And if so, why? Now, here's an important point. Investigators are not just asking whether access occurred. They are asking whether it occurred in a way that fits the overall sequence of events. Because in a well-documented case, everything should line up. The logs, the reports, the communications, they should all tell the same story. So what does this tell us? It tells us that any mismatch between those elements becomes a point of focus. Now, let's connect this back to the broader case. Up to now, much of the investigation has focused on physical evidence and the 4 one-minute window at the home. But this new layer introduces something different, a second timeline. Not of events in the physical world, but of information inside the investigation. And those two timelines need to match. If they do not, investigators have to determine why. Now, as we reach the end of this part, here is the key takeaway. The access logs do not provide a direct answer about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but they do provide a detailed record of how information about the case was handled in real time. And when that record does not fully align with the official sequence, it becomes something investigators cannot ignore. In the next part, we are going to bring these two timelines together, the physical events and the internal information flow, and examine the most logical explanation that fits both. Because once those timelines are placed side by side, the central question becomes very clear. Do they support each other, or do they point in different directions? Now we bring everything together. Two timelines, two ways of understanding what happened, and one central question: do they fit into a single, consistent sequence? Let's begin with what we can rely on. Nancy Guthrie returns home at approximately 9:50 p.m. on the 31st of January 2026. At 1:47 a.m., the front door camera stops transmitting. At 2:12 a.m., motion is detected on the property. And at 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker stops syncing. Those points have remained consistent from the beginning. They are supported by recorded data, and they define the window investigators continue to focus on. So what does this tell us? It tells us the physical timeline remains the foundation of the case. It is stable, and it has not been replaced by any new evidence. Now, alongside that, we have the second timeline: access logs, internal reviews, communication patterns. And within that, we have something different, not contradictions in the traditional sense, but areas where the sequence is not perfectly aligned. Moments where access appears earlier than expected. Moments where documentation follows after activity has already taken place. So what does this tell us? It tells us the internal timeline introduces questions, but not definitive conclusions. Now, let's move to the most important part of this analysis: Which explanation best fits both timelines at the same time? Because that is how investigators approach this stage. They do not choose one timeline over the other. They look for a version of events that allows both to exist without conflict. The first explanation is procedural, that the early access and timing differences are the result of how modern systems operate. Automated alerts, supervisory visibility, real-time monitoring. In this explanation, the timelines appear slightly out of order, but still follow a logical structure when system behavior is taken into account. The second explanation is investigative, that the sequence of access and documentation may not fully match standard procedure and therefore requires closer review, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that needs to be examined carefully. Now, based on what is publicly available, the first explanation remains the most consistent with the evidence. Because there is no confirmed link between the access activity and the physical events at Nancy Guthrie's home, there is no direct evidence placing any individual, including those with early access, into the sequence of what happened during that 4-1-minute window. So what does this tell us? It tells us that, at this stage, the timing differences are more likely explained by system behavior than by direct involvement. Now, that does not mean the second explanation is dismissed. Investigators will continue to review those logs, compare them against procedures, and test whether every action can be accounted for. Because in cases like this, even small inconsistencies are examined thoroughly. But until a clear connection is established, those inconsistencies remain part of a secondary line of inquiry. Now, let's step back and look at the broader picture. The case began with a clear focus: what happened inside the home during a 4-1-minute window. That focus remains. What has changed is the scope. Investigators are now also examining how information about that event moved in real time. And that adds depth to the investigation, but it does not replace the original timeline. So what does this tell us? It tells us the investigation is expanding, not shifting entirely. Now, here is the final takeaway. The new FBI evidence does not confirm that anyone inside the system is responsible. It does not establish a suspect. What it does is highlight how closely investigators are examining every part of the case, including how information was accessed and handled. And that level of scrutiny is consistent with how complex investigations evolve over time. Now, as we close, there is one question worth considering. When new evidence raises questions about the process, but does not change the core timeline, how should that be understood? As a sign of a deeper issue, or as part of the normal complexity of a modern investigation? If you have been following this case, you can see how each new detail adds another layer rather than a final answer. If you would like to continue following careful, evidence-based breakdowns like this, you can subscribe and stay with us. Because in the end, understanding this case will depend on how these timelines eventually align and what that alignment reveals. Now that we have both timelines laid out, the physical events and the internal information flow, the next step is to test whether they can realistically fit together. Because in an investigation like this, alignment is everything. If the sequence of events and the sequence of awareness match, the case remains consistent. If they do not, investigators have to understand why. So let's begin with a practical question. What would it look like if everything followed a standard process? In most cases, an event happens first. A system records it. Then, someone accesses that information. After that, it is reviewed, discussed, and formally documented. That order: event, access, documentation is what investigators expect to see. Now, when they reviewed the Nancy Guthrie case, they began comparing that expected sequence with what actually occurred. And this is where things required closer attention. Because while much of the timeline does follow that structure, there are points where the sequence is less clear. Not necessarily wrong, but not perfectly aligned either. So what does this tell us? It tells us the case contains moments where the normal flow of information may have moved faster or differently than expected. Now, let's look at how investigators test that. They begin by mapping every recorded action, each timestamp from the physical timeline, each access log entry, each communication that can be verified, and then they place those on a single, continuous timeline. When they do that, patterns begin to appear. Some sequences align cleanly, others appear compressed, and a few may raise questions because they do not follow the expected order. Now, Here's where interpretation becomes critical. A compressed sequence where access happens quickly after an event can still be normal, especially in urgent situations. But if access appears before an event is formally recognized, that requires explanation. So investigators ask a simple question. Does the system itself account for this? For example, automated alerts can trigger access logs before a human formally reviews the event. Supervisory systems can flag activity in real time. And some platforms allow continuous monitoring where data is being observed as it happens. All of these can create timestamps that appear earlier than expected. So what does this tell us? It tells us that technology can sometimes make timelines look out of order, even when they are not. Now, let's connect this back to the individuals involved. As mentioned earlier, some of the access activity is associated with roles that have broader visibility: supervisors, administrators, people responsible for overseeing systems rather than just responding to incidents. That level of access allows them to see information earlier than others. But it also means their actions are more visible in the logs. And because of that, their activity is often examined more closely. Now, here's where the investigation becomes more focused. Investigators are not just asking whether access occurred early. They are asking whether the pattern of access matches what those roles typically do. Because every position has expected behavior, and when behavior falls outside that pattern, it draws attention. So what does this tell us? It tells us that context, role, responsibility, and procedure is essential when interpreting these logs. Now, let's bring in the broader picture again. Up to this point, we have two timelines that do not fully contradict each other, but do not perfectly align either. The physical timeline remains stable. The internal timeline introduces areas that need explanation, and that is where the investigation is focused. Now, here's an important clarification. At this stage, there is no confirmed evidence that directly connects any internal access activity to the events that occurred at Nancy Guthrie's home. That distinction matters, because without that connection, the access logs remain part of a separate line of inquiry. They raise questions, but they do not answer the central one. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the investigation is testing possibilities, not confirming conclusions. Now, let's move toward a clear takeaway for this part. When investigators analyze both timelines together, they are not looking for perfection. They are looking for consistency, a sequence that makes sense when all pieces are considered. And right now, the sequence is close, but not complete. There are areas that fit, and areas that still require explanation. Now, as we close this part, there is one key question that remains. If these timing differences can be explained by system behavior and procedure, then the case returns to its original focus, the events at the home. But if they cannot be fully explained, then the investigation may continue to examine how information moved during those early hours. Because sometimes understanding how a case unfolded internally can reveal details that are not immediately visible in the physical evidence. And that is where the case stands right now. Balance between two explanations. One procedural, one that may require further review. In the final part, we are going to bring everything together and look at which explanation fits best with the evidence we have and what that means for the direction of the investigation going forward. Now let's place both timelines side by side, the physical timeline and the information timeline. Because at this stage, the investigation is no longer just about what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home. It is also about how quickly those events were understood and by whom. So we begin again with what we know is fixed. Nancy Guthrie returns home at approximately 9:50 p.m. on the 31st of January, 2026. At 1:47 a.m., the front door camera stops transmitting. At 2:12 a.m., motion is detected on the property. And at 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker stops syncing. Those are the anchor points. They are supported by recorded data. They define when something happened. Now, next to that, we place the second timeline: access logs, internal reviews, communication patterns within the investigation. And the question investigators are asking is straightforward. Do these two timelines align? Now, here's where things begin to narrow. If the physical events occurred within that 4-1-minute window, then awareness of those events should follow shortly after, but not before. That is the expected sequence. Event first, then access, then documentation. But according to reporting and analysis, there are moments where that sequence may not be perfectly aligned. Instances where access appears earlier than expected, or where information seems to surface before it is formally documented. Now, here's where we have to be careful. An earlier timestamp does not automatically mean prior knowledge of the event. It can reflect system alerts, routine checks, or automated processes. So investigators do not look at a single timestamp in isolation. They look for patterns, repeated instances, consistency across multiple records. So what does this tell us? It tells us that one unusual entry is not enough, but a pattern of them becomes meaningful. Now, let's consider the most important question. Is there a consistent explanation that allows both timelines to fit together? Because if there is, then the case remains internally consistent. If there is not, then investigators have to consider alternative explanations. Now, based on what is publicly known, there are two main possibilities being examined. The first is procedural, that the early access and timing differences can be explained by how modern systems operate, automated alerts, supervisory reviews, and fast-moving responses during the early stages of an investigation. In this scenario, the timelines may look uneven, but still fall within normal operational behavior. The second possibility is structural, that the flow of information did not follow the standard sequence, that awareness, access, and documentation may have occurred out of order in a way that requires closer examination. Now, here's the key difference between those two. The first explains the inconsistencies as part of the system. The second treats them as something that needs to be investigated further. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the meaning of the evidence depends on which explanation holds up under closer review. Now, let's bring in the role of reporting, including observations from Brian Entin. His coverage has focused on how certain details in the case have surfaced and how investigators have responded to them over time. Not as conclusions, but as indicators of where attention is shifting. And in this case, that attention appears to be moving toward the internal handling of information. Now, here's where we move toward the most logical explanation based on the evidence available. At this stage, the access logs and timing discrepancies do not establish that any individual is responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie. They do not provide direct evidence of involvement. What they do provide is a detailed record of how information moved during the early stages of the investigation. And that record shows areas that do not fully align with the expected sequence. So what does this tell us? It tells us that investigators are examining whether those differences can be explained within normal procedures or whether they require further scrutiny. Now, let's take a step back and look at the broader picture. The case began with a focus on physical events. What happened inside the home? What happened within that 4-1-minute window? But as new evidence is reviewed, the scope has expanded. Now it includes how the investigation itself unfolded in real time. And that expansion does not replace the original timeline. It adds another layer to it. Now, here is the final takeaway for this part. The evidence pointing toward internal access and timing discrepancies does not provide a final answer, but it does introduce a new line of inquiry, one that focuses on the sequence of information, not just the sequence of events. And that line of inquiry will only become meaningful if it connects clearly with the physical timeline. Now, as we close, there is a question worth considering. When two timelines exist in the same case, one based on events and one based on information, what matters more? The order in which things happened, or the order in which they were understood? If you have been following this case, you can see how each new detail adds another layer rather than a simple conclusion. If you would like to continue following careful, evidence-based breakdowns like this, you can subscribe and stay with us. Because in the end, understanding this case will depend on whether those two timelines eventually align and what that alignment reveals.